My name is Simmons Buntin. I'm the editor-in-chief of Terrain.org. I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, where I respectfully acknowledge my presence on the traditional and ancestral lands of the O'odham and Pascua Yaqui, as well as the beautiful saguaro and creosote-populated valleys and hills and arroyos nestled between the Santa Catalina, Rincon, Santa Rita, Tortolita, and Tucson mountains. So again, welcome. I want to thank Sandra Steingraber and Taylor Brorby for what I know is going to be a really amazing conversation this evening. I also want to thank our three special attendees who are not quite sure why I've invited them, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us on what I hope for you is a lovely summer evening. Politics of the world aside, of course. So if your connection becomes slow, you may want to turn off your video. And just so you know, in case you're hearing kind of a fan sound, that's for me. I will mute when we get going in the conversation and you won't hear that. In all cases, please yourself remain muted, but you're welcome to post your questions and other positive feedback in the chat, and we're likely to open it up to audio questions during the Q&A that follows our conversation today. So we're recording this and all of our readings and conversations, and make those available from the Terrain.org website under events and from our YouTube channel, and I'll get this one live in a couple days after this. We'd love it if you would officially follow our YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/c/Terrainorg. This is our last reading of the summer, and we'll begin in September, including an autumn reading with the Institute for American Indian Arts. Links to register for the reading may be found on Terrain.org, as well as our Facebook page once those are live, and they're not live just yet. I also kind of want to shout out that we continue to seek sponsors for our readings and conversations, and if you are interested or know an organization that we should reach out to, please contact me at info@terrain.org. I will be posting Terrain.org and book links in the chat in support of our conversation this evening. But if you missed those or want to find books by tonight's readers and other Terrain.org contributors, hop on over to our bookshop page at bookshop.org/shop/Terrainorg, or find the link under About in the Terrain.org website navigation menu. So now, a word about Terrain.org, the world's first online journal of place, publishing since 1998 and celebrating next year our 25th anniversary. We're just coming off of our third AWP Small Press Publisher Award finalist selection in a row, and this evening I have two very exciting announcements. The first is this: we have partnered with the Soul Family Collection in Literature, Community, and the Natural World, as well as Texas Tech University, to offer the Soul Emerging Writers Prize. A new annual book prize for a first or second book that begins with nonfiction this year, poetry next year, and fiction the third year, and then we'll cycle back through. The prize this year is $1,000, and it does have a $25 entry fee, and submissions will open August 1st and close October 31st at the Terrain.org submittable submission portal. So get your manuscripts ready and keep an eye out for that. Now, it is my greater delight to announce the 2021-2022 Terrain.org Editors Prizes. All Terrain.org contributions from the previous year by writers of color, members of the LGBTQ+ community, women and/or other marginalized communities whose contributions explore place particularly in the context of social, environmental, or climate justice are considered for this annual prize, which carries an award of $500 and is selected by the poetry, nonfiction, and fiction editors. The 2021-2022 Editors Prize in Poetry goes to Stacy Bowe Miller for her stunning poems For Cousins, Mother Any Given Day, When I Say Memory, and Miscarriage, appearing in Terrain.org on July 26, 2021. And I'm going to let somebody into the room here. And now I'm going to go quickly find those poems, which really are amazing. I don't want to bias that, but Stacy, these were my favorite poems this year. Okay, so here is the link to those if folks would like to check that out. So congratulations, Stacy.
Thank you so much. What an honor. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. Now, the 2021-2022 Editor's Prize in Nonfiction goes to Ho-Ming So Denduangrudi for her letter to America published on June 22nd, 2021. Let me find that one and put it in here. A stellar letter to America that seems ever more timely all the time, for better or worse. And finally, so congratulations, Ho-Ming. Are you here? I think maybe. Let's see. Thought she was going to be here. But okay. So congratulations to Ho-Ming for this, for her stellar letter to America and for the prize. And finally, the 2021-2022 Editor's Prize in Fiction goes to Siamak Vasuchi for his short story After the Creek, which published on April 23rd, 2021. Let me give you the link for that one. Oh, the balancing of Zoom. There it is. So, of course, do not read those during this conversation, but save those links for after. Of course, if you go to terrain.org, we'll publish a news announcement on this tomorrow, and you'll be able to find the links there as well. Okay. So again, a big round of applause to all of our Terrains.org Editor Prize winners for their amazing work. Thank you for sharing that with Terrain.org and our audience, and congratulations. And I'll follow up with you after the conversation this evening too, to make sure that you get your prize, your much deserved prize. So a little bit more about our endeavor here. Terrain.org is an all-volunteer organization that doesn't charge to access our content, nor charge to submit, well, contests and new book prizes notwithstanding, nor contain advertising. Indeed, we are run by the power of goodwill and dedicated weekends and evenings, and I like to think by love. And we are run by donations from good folks like you. We are, through our parent organization, Terrain Publishing, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and donations to support our efforts are tax deductible. So please consider donating, or telling your family to donate, or your friends, or your enemies even, at terrain.org/donate. Thank you. Okay, enough about that. So finally, one more reminder. Our contest submissions in fiction, nonfiction, and poetry are open through Labor Day. That's September 5th this year, judged by Sean Hill in poetry, Janice Ray in nonfiction, and Callie Fajardo Anstein in fiction, who you may notice is on the cover of this month's Poets and Writers magazine. All right, enough about terrain.org. Let's get to the reason we're all here for these amazing two people. Again, we'll have Q&A. Post your chat in, or post your question in chat, and we'll be sure to get to that afterwards. And again, thanks for joining us. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Sandra Steingraber, who will introduce Taylor Brorby as she kicks off their conversation. Oh, let me let Janice in here. Okay. Or Janine. All right. So, biologist, author, and cancer survivor Sandra Steingraber is an expert on the environmental links to cancer and reproductive health, and much more, really. Her book, Living Downstream, An Ecologist Looks at Cancer and the Environment, presents cancer as a human rights issue, bringing together data on toxic releases with data from U.S. cancer registries. Having Faith, an ecologist's journey to motherhood, which, by the way, has the most amazing childbirth scene ever written, is a memoir of her own pregnancy and an investigation of fetal toxicology, revealing how environmental hazards threaten each crucial stage of infant development. And in her book, Raising Elijah, Protecting Our Children in an Age of Environmental Crisis, Sandra demonstrates how closely the private, intimate world of parenting connects to the public world of policymaking, and how the ongoing environmental crisis is fundamentally a crisis of family life. She served on President Clinton's National Action Plan on Breast Cancer and briefed UN delegates in Geneva on dioxin contamination of breast milk. The Sierra Club has called her the new Rachel Carson, and Carson's own alma mater gave Sandra its Rachel Carson Leadership Award. In '97, she was named a Miss Magazine Woman of the Year. She's appeared on The Today Show, Good Morning America, and many other places, and including terrain.org. And just so let me get a little more personal here. I first met Sandra remotely over email when I conducted an interview with her that published in Terrain.org back now, can you believe this, Sandra, in 2007, 15 years ago. That's amazing to me, if my math is correct. I then had the good fortune of spending time with her and her son Elijah in upstate Vermont for a writing conference. If you can't tell by her books, and I know we've all read many of them, what you realize when you meet Sandra in person is that she is an amazing and selfless person, really as an amazing and selfless person as you could ever hope or meet. And we are fortunate to have her in this world, on our side, in this or any day or age. So Sandra, thank you for joining us. Thank you for this conversation with Taylor Brorby, and take it away.
Well, hello everyone, and happy Pride. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Taylor Brorby, and I'm going to do that right away. So I'm going to do this because he has a new book, which I'm holding in my hands, and I'm going to read to you from Act 3, Scene 2, which is a section called Sprout, the second chapter of that section. And the scene here is the speaker is off the North Dakota prairie and finds himself in this strange world of college when he's invited by a professor to hear a recording. And here are these sentences. When the last high C crescendoed and the music finished, Jonathan emerged from a transfixed state. Ah, he said, as if savoring wine. What was that, Professor? I asked. That was a young Luciano Pavarotti. Barbara and I saw him before he was a superstar in 1972. But of course, he was always a superstar. So that's what we're doing. We're seeing the young Taylor Brorby before he becomes a superstar. But of course, he's always been a superstar. So I couldn't be more pleased. And here is the more official introduction to our author tonight. Taylor Brorby is the author of Crude, Poems About Place, Energy, and Politics, and Coming Alive, Action and Civil Disobedience, and is the co-author of Fracture, Essays, Poems, and Stories on Fracking in America. His work has been supported by the National Book Critics Circle, the McDowell Colony, Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture, and Mesa Refuge. Taylor's work has appeared in the Huffington Post, Orion Magazine, and North Dakota Quarterly, and it's been widely anthologized. He's a contributing editor at North American Review and serves on the editorial boards of Terrain.org, of course, and Hub City Press. He regularly speaks around the country on topics related to extractive economies, queerness, disability, and climate change. And Taylor and I are both readers for each other's work, and we've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years talking about nature and queerness. And Taylor, I'm going to start us off right there as we jump into your amazing book, Voice and Oil, Growing Up Gay in a Fractured Land, and talk about the queerness of this book. So I'm going to say a few things, and then you're going to tell me if I'm right or wrong about this. So here's how I see this book. It's a gay memoir, and it's in good company, right? We think about things like Running with Scissors or Boy Erased. But it's also a memoir that's embedded within the natural world. And so we're in familiar territory too here, because the readers of Terry Tempest Williams, for example, will see a lot of familiar things in the way there's a blending of natural history and a coming of age memoir. But we've never really exactly seen this view, because it's a queer memoir, but it's set in rural America, not in urban America, and specifically in the sort of untamed Western setting of rural North Dakota, where the landscape we see are buttes and prairies and antelope. We see the protagonist hunting and fly fishing. We see trout and cattle and sturgeon, and we spend time at the most masculine of all rivers, the wide Missouri. The story is organized in these 7 sections, all of which are named for parts of plants: roots, sprout, shoot, blade, fluorescence, and floret. And we go into deep geological time, down into the bedrock of North Dakota itself, where there are trilobites and prehistoric creatures. But it seems to me that when nature is queered, we have this whole other view that we've never seen before. You say that there was something I craved in the landscape, something soft, something that you couldn't find in the preordained world. So there's something sort of not preordained about this. As we see a boy become a man in a landscape that's wild, which, it's like man summits a mountain and has emotions. We know that sort of story, but this is a man who's fleeing football, a boy who's fleeing heteronormative behaviors that he finds confining. And what he sees in nature is so extra, so kind of campy, and so dramatic. All of the creatures there, the creatures are like a pride parade in themselves. There's 3,000 species of insects, you tell us. There's this fantastical dramatic lighting with the aurora borealis. I mean, how gay is that, right? And yet also there's this woundedness, right? There's these wagon train ruts that can never be healed, that you put your hands on and you take us to this place. So, and then even in its diminishment, as these creatures are disappearing in this fractured landscape, like the sturgeon that's endangered, the boy speaker sees in the disappearance that the loneliness he feels as a gay person who knows no other gay people is mirrored in these misfits, like this giant sturgeon that's also endangered, and you feel his loneliness as the only way a gay boy could. So the world is also full of creatures that are prey animal. They're prey, and that need to hide and need to not be detected and need to be camouflaged and need to engage in mimicry. So they're not, and so you see yourself reflected in this queer way there too, because you're trying to mimic heteronormative things. So you're like the deer that everyone else is hunting, who is trying to hide and avoid detection. So we see you traipsing around in your mother's high heel shoes, and you say it's like a newborn egret, right? Which is sort of an amazing, again, this sort of the campiness of nature kind of comes through for us. So it's nature is a serene place for you. It's an escape, but it's also, as the book goes on, and you're now a man in this world with other male lovers, it's a place of great danger, because that's also, who knows what that truck behind who's following you is, right? So nature is both refuge and a place of great danger. And in that, I feel like women will recognize themselves, right? Because for us who go out into nature, it's our whole experience of being like way alone in the woods has a chronic element of fear that runs through it. Okay, so that's my take on the queerness of this book, and I want you to now talk. I'm a terrible interviewer. Anyway, this is how I read your book, and you can riff on that any way you want.
That's incredible. I would love to say that was all intentional. I think you need to read and give me book reports on what I'm up to every step of the way. I mean, I think there's just synergy in that, of when you're exploring such a large canvas like I am, the Northern Great Plains, it's such a diverse area, but we reduce it to a stubble by calling it, flyover country. But it's an intermingled landscape that's dependent on each other, and they're crazy furry ottomans called badgers that chase you, and beautiful great blue heron and things like this. And I think for me, I'll just speak for me, when growing up being gay and having hobbies that didn't quite fit in, by which I mean, I never wanted to play football. I played baseball. I had a big crush on Kirby Puckett when I was growing up. But there weren't these sort of, I would never sit down and watch football on Sunday with my father. And reading wasn't really encouraged. If I was caught with a book, my parents would say, why don't you go and do something? Which meant go outside. So reading wasn't an activity. But I got trained in how to observe things by going outside, by taking my tackle box and a sketchbook. And I think that any gay person, any queer person can relate to this. You are trained in observation, because if people aren't speaking about something you're experiencing, let's say same-sex attraction, for instance, you know, oh, maybe I shouldn't talk about that because no one else is. So maybe I have to keep that to myself. Or how do I try to fit in if no one's talking about the things I'm talking about, or has similar interests to what I have? That innately creates this sense of othering. I think that's inherently queer. And I think to be trained in observation is something rather queer, because let us just be honest, straight men get such a wide pass for being clueless about everything, including how to cook or, you know, boil a tea kettle, where I think being queer means you're at least sensitive to both the needs of yourself, the needs of others, and I hope in this book, the needs of nature as well. But coming from a landscape that very few people write about, you know, one that's under great duress from fossil fuel economies. You know, I'm symbolically covered in oil tonight, you know, dressed in black. And it's a place that I keep thinking we need to pay more attention to, because my home landscape, the locations in this book, they're the canary in the coal mines. They're the testing grounds for the country's worst ideas of hydraulic fracking, strip mining, Native American reservations, damming of the Missouri River. Minutemen missile silos are in North Dakota, nuclear warheads pointing across the ice caps to Russia. Violence against women. North Dakota is regularly ranked the drunkest state in the country. And I keep thinking to be queer means you're asking questions, whether they're out loud or at least internally. So like for me, for example, growing up in that part of the world or being around extractive economies, how could you hope for people to be anything but violent or being drunk all the time when their lives have been reduced to a stubble as well? That the modern economics has dictated to them the only way of, in fact, earning a living is destroying the landscape on which you live, whether that's in the Red River, which is a monoculture of sugar beets, or that's farther west where I grew up with coal mining and hydraulic fracking. And so I think part of that is when you grow up sort of separate from the culture, whether intentionally or otherwise, you start to ask deeper questions that maybe the main culture isn't asking, or maybe they are privately, but they're certainly not talking about it, because it's better to push down and fit into the status quo and go with the flow than to resist that. It's a lot harder to resist that.
I appreciate all of that. And it seems to me as I read this book that there's a number of through lines in that landscape, and one of them is violence. Because you as the speaker of the tale can at any moment be the target of that violence, you are both bearing witness to a violent, fractured place, but you're also in danger yourself. So that gives the whole book a kind of double vision, and a vulnerability and a sort of edginess. And so there are scenes in this book where we see outright hateful acts directed against you. And the specter of Matthew Shepard hangs across this book. He's at one point you describe him as a semaphore, a scarecrow, that he's kind of always kind of hanging there just across the border. And then we also, you narrate two acts of potential acts of violence against yourself and self-harm. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about your decisions around how to narrate that, or go anywhere you want with it. The role of violence in this book, the role of violence against the natural world and against the LGBTQ community as you experience in your lived life, and how as an author you wove that through here.
Yeah. I mean, it goes without saying that we live in a very violent culture continually, whether we admit that or not. And I think as a writer, I keep thinking about how am I giving evidence or giving examples, whether that's through micro vignettes, to just show some of the culture I grew up in. I mean, for instance, there was a man in my small town who they almost looked like freckles, but they weren't. And I asked my father, I said, you know, why does that man have all those marks on his forearm? I knew this man he lived in a house without running water or electricity, and he worked at our local gas station, the one in the county. He was very friendly and kind, unassuming. And my dad said, well, every night he goes down to this bar and he doesn't have any money. And so he allows the coal miners to sizzle out their cigarettes on his skin so he can have a shot of Lord Calvert, you know, or some other type of whiskey sort of thing. And I thought, that's such an intimate act that's so incredibly violent. And that can be extrapolated to many other things. And one of my first memories I can actually remember, rather than a glimmer of a memory or, you know, how we have these intense moments, is I can remember the entire news segment when I was 10, just about to turn 11, hearing about the murder of Matthew Shepard. And I had no clue what being gay was at that age or anything like this, but it was terrifying to me that whatever that word meant, two other young men found it worth their while to murder another young man over that fact and leave him for dead on a barbed wire fence. And that planted a seed in my mind, though I wouldn't yet know until a few years later what actually being gay meant and what in my own body same-sex attraction was, and thought, oh my goodness, remember that man? And that's not so very far from where you live. I mean, I have an aunt and uncle that live in Gillette, Wyoming. And so that felt so very close, but that there are these other things, I guess, in me, for better or for worse. I'm a stubborn Norwegian that feels like I need to get where the action is, you know, that it's so typical and understandable. And I crave this at different points for queer people to flee to liberal cities. And I don't want anyone to put themselves in undue, you know, harm or put them at risk in situations. I'm still a man, though, who loves fly fishing in gin clear streams, and those don't run through San Francisco, you know, or I love having a icy beer when I was drinking beer at the Lake Crescent Lodge out on the Olympic Peninsula, which, you know, FDR wheeled around there and thought there needs to be a great national park here. But beyond Lake Crescent Lodge, the peninsula becomes something quite different from what we call supple conservation. People can look up what happened in 2020 in a Vice News story where locals in Forks, Washington thought a family that was camping on the peninsula were part of Antifa, and how they were trapped out on the peninsula. A very terrifying event the summer after I had lived out there. There's part of it that I think I guess I view it as a writer as part of my duty and obligation to give a queer perspective in extractive economies, since my entire family works in that industry. I benefited from it growing up, that getting into these places where we are literally ruining the earth feels like something I have to do to try to create some connective tissue in our culture, to say the Olympic Peninsula is not so very different from Western North Dakota, is not so very different from the mountaintops of West Virginia, you know, even though these are radically different landscapes. And violence is at the root of all of that. And it's typically led by men in power, whether they're politicians or CEOs of corporations that want to strip things or blow them up or clear cut them. And so there's a way that I think as a writer, by being present, it is by being a gay man, I think I am taking on the straight establishment in my observation and being present and telling stories once I come back from those places, whether I've felt risk or I've been assaulted or been followed.
Well, I know that as your reader, I was struck by these periodic acts of violence that come in and out of the narrative, or things that could have been violent had you not done something slightly differently, right? And including the scenes where you let us know that you could have turned that violence against yourself in a couple of dark moments, right? That the way it's this sort of matter-of-fact narration, like you don't warn us at all. There's no like ominous buildup of music to, you know, of scary music to let us know someone's following you. It's so casual that I'm wondering, like you almost have to go back and reread, like, wait, what just happened?
Right.
This kid got these cigarettes put out on his arm, what? Like, and then you just go on to describe these other kind of quotidian details in the landscape. And there's something really stunning about that. I mean, that makes it feel just the casualness of it almost. How did you, like, tell us about your kind of writerly choices around that when you're narrating a scene where blood will spill, possibly your own?
Yeah.
How do you go into that? Like, what choices do you make?
I think that's how I experience life. In my own experience, so even to come back to what you had asked me earlier about contemplating or literally trying to execute my own self-harm, it seems we always get these stories by people. Let's just think, you know, Saturday was Anthony Bourdain Day, and I never met Anthony Bourdain, and I miss him and I feel some affinity. I mean, I just thought he was the coolest dude ever, as complicated as he was. People always find violence shocking or self-harm shocking. And I think it slips in deceptively quiet moments. And I guess as an author, I thought that's how it has to slip into my book. It's not a bang. It's a gradual build in intensity, whether that's through narrative technique or by slight distraction. Let's look over here and wait, how did we get here? This boy didn't seem like he could be suicidal. This guy didn't quite, though he's struggling, doesn't seem like he's going to get up on a bridge and do anything that could change the whole narrative of a book. But we always seem to find it shocking when someone like Robin Williams commits suicide. People who narrate their pain or who are very open about it, I'm less worried about them. It's the people who seem hunky-dory. It's the friends who always check in on their friends, but aren't getting checked in on, that we have to be worried about. And I hope in part of what I'm trying to do in this book is to show that people that on the surface seem stable, I would argue rarely are. people who have the best sense of humor know how close the darkness can be, or have survived the darkness in those ways. And I think that's so close to reality, at least as I've experienced it. You know, people who are literally hurting, I grew up with them. They filled those bars every night, or they shot helpless animals just to have power, some type of power, because they didn't have power in their lives. They were taking orders to break their body, save for retirement, hope they're not going to get cancer, and if it comes, that their savings account is large enough that they can afford that. You know, and so there's a way, I think, in this book, I wanted violence to exist in this sexy plainness close to my resplendent prairie, because in fact it really does. A lot of people can feel lonely in that part of the world, or angry against what they've been given, and they might not even have the language to express that, or the means to get out of it. So that choice, I think, maybe not intentional, though it felt, I guess, you know, part of it is, I want to be very clear with listeners, though I think I work hard and write quite a bit and try to make my sentences sing. At the end of the day, it just feels like you just let it rip and try to tell your story as best you can, you know. And so it just felt like, oh my God, well, if I don't go there, I'm not giving the reader the sense of my narrative, the authentic self. And I think since I've been so close to those dark moments, and then sometimes when I'm not in my right mind, historically speaking, probably wanted them, I wanted to also show how it made me so committed to put my body on the line for other things. You know, when I got arrested over the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, I put my body on the line to end my life. I wanted to put my body on the line in very different ways in this book to also show how I'm trying to protect life.
Well, it's a book about the body in so many different ways. I mean, the landscape is also a kind of body, and the body becomes a place of disability. It becomes a place where violence is practiced upon. It becomes you choosing to defend a river with your body in an act of civil disobedience. So I see that as another through line of this book is the body. And let me ask you about wrestling, which is another theme, right? Which is the body is it's like a sport where the body is, that's all it is two bodies grappling. And so I have to tell you that one of the fun things about being anybody's reader, but especially about being yours, is when you're like, I'm reading this because I really want to read a queer memoir, but along the way I end up learning all these things about wrestling, which is a sport I have no experience in, no real interest in, but I now know the names of all these different holds. And I just love that, because you just kind of offer this up in it, like you're teaching me all about wrestling and I don't even notice it, right? Like you managed to do that without like, now I shall teach you about wrestling in a separate, like, you know, right. It's not like that at all. It's not sort of didactic in any way, but along the way I've learned about this, and it keeps coming back, right? We see you as a kid wrestling. We see these sort of wrestling matches with you and, is it Sean, I believe, later on? Chris.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then we deal with the lie that you tell about wrestling. So talk about that, because it's easy to say, oh, wrestling is so homoerotic, but it's a lot more than that. It seems to me like it's you needing to prove your strength against these other of your cohorts, both as boys and then later on as men. There are these sort of like one-on-one secret wrestling matches that go on. So say more about that and why wrestling kind of comes in and out of this book.
Yeah. It's so rare in American culture in particular for men to show affection towards each other or to even be physically close. For instance, at least from my vantage point, it seems a lot more common that girls in middle school will have slumber parties and maybe all 4 of them will sleep in the same bed. But God forbid if 4 boys of the same age did such a thing. So that there's something in the culture to teach boys who grow into men, you can have hobbies or interests, but you might be more liable to sock someone in the shoulder or shove them into the locker, even if you call him friend and things like this. And in my small town, wrestling would have been like the actual sport of which I did not participate, though my father thought I should. And I grew up with like Hulk Hogan as a father. You know, one of the first memories I have of my dad is saying, Brorby men never tap out or never tap out. And that's such a thing in my mind still. It's probably why I think if I write one great sentence, I can stop hydraulic fracking. I have that, it's like they're gonna have to kill me before they make me give up and things like this. But there's something, it's so intimate to be that close to another man, which you're not told is appropriate as a boy or a man. And so for me, it had to be in there because it both is labeled a homo. I mean, many gay men will talk about, oh yeah, watching professional wrestling growing up, all those oily buff men is how I knew maybe I wasn't like other boys or things like this. There's a way that of course it is homoerotic, but I also think there's a way in which it's just being that physically close, because men most of the time aren't taught to express ourselves, aren't to give language. And so you can push against each other, you can roll around, I guess. It's so taboo to even talk about it because wrestling is such a taboo sport in which to talk about it because it involves the body. It's a same-sex sport. It's physical closeness, hot, oniony breath, things like this. And we don't talk about those things or desire, even apart from sexual desire, just the desire to be close to someone. During that, I can think of just a different example of at St. Olaf College, which is really renowned for the study of Soren Kierkegaard outside of Copenhagen. The retired Kierkegaard scholar, Goran Marino, is a well-known boxer. He's actually good friends with Mike Tyson, and he coaches local boxers. Here's this guy talking about beauty and suppleness. And he talks about boys who are sparring and they might spar against each other and then they walk out with their arms around each other. And I don't watch boxing. I can't handle people getting hit or struck at. Yet there's something in that space. And I think that's what I'm also trying to show in this complicatedness of, I am my father's son. I like feeling like I can topple anyone if I wanted to, but I never want to get hit. I don't want to fight anyone. I just want to, like, you know, put you in a chicken wing and make you say uncle. You know, it's great satisfaction. But there's a way that tangledness, I think, of that sport has been sort of a way of thinking through tangled relationships, whether it's to people or our existence on the planet as well.
Well, thanks. That's really that's a good gloss, I think, on so much of this on this book. I want to talk now about the religiosity in here. And I'm, you know, you and I have known each other for quite a while, and of the many surprises as I read was to learn that you actually didn't grow up in the church. I was all ready to assume that you had, right? That this Lutheranism is, and we know that, I know that you went to divinity school and you narrate that chapter of your life. So, but to realize that unlike the story of so many of us who are gay, like I'll just use myself, I was adopted out of a Methodist orphanage and held there for 3 months into a upstanding couple from the Methodist Church. And so Methodism completely constructed my life. So I spent the next 18 years in the Methodist Church. Just as an aside, because this is now in the news, my mom my adoptive mom was infertile because she'd had an ectopic pregnancy and nearly bled out, and was saved by a small town surgeon who knew that the embryo was doomed in her exploded fallopian tube, and saved my mother's life at age 26. And when she woke up, she was no longer pregnant, and also told she could never have a child because just so much damage had been done. And so her near-death experience as a woman, a young woman in this big farm family, the whole congregation was praying for her, and this was the outcome they wanted. And so her great reward for this, her second lease on life, was to be able to adopt me. And there's a whole, I have my own whole story about what that kind of, the enforced gratitude to be that kind of gift for someone, right? But it's in the news now because suddenly all of these trigger states where with Roe gone, abortion is criminalized, that often includes women who have ectopic pregnancies. So I know this week I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, this idea of abortion and adoption being two sides of some coin of unwanted forced birth. But in fact, there are adoptive women who are alive because they had an abortion for medical reasons and now need to adopt. So all of that for me as a gay woman, the gratitude that I was required to feel as my Methodist mother's adopted child who came from this place, I had to leave behind. So my coming out was all about getting further and further away from Methodism, even though I feel like you can hear it in my writing, right? I've had students write book reports and explicative essays about my work and have found, wrote a whole paper on the imagery of communion in chapter 7 of Steingraber's, because there's blood in a toilet, right? So that's a chalice. And so it's like, I mean, I know it's there, but it's like woven into my DNA. And the Methodist Church now is busy letting LGBTQ people know they can't get married in the church, and they will not allow big half of the church is going to split over this. They will not allow gay clergy, right?
Right.
So here's this church that entirely created my identity that refuses to acknowledge my queerness.
Yeah.
And so I have this very big, complicated relationship with the Methodist Church. Somehow I thought that you were the same with Lutheranism, but not so, au contraire, right? So essentially, you have a story that, and I'm going to let you tell it, about your parents' decision about their child, your older sister, and how that created a marriage, how it moved them from one church to another. And there's an adoption element in there, but you ended up going into, tell me if I've got the denomination right, the Evangelical Lutheran Church as a refuge away from homophobia. That is like a plot twist for me. I was all ready for you to be a kid growing up in the Lutheran Church and needing to leave that behind to find your authentic self, but it was just the reverse of what I was thinking. So why don't you tell that piece of it?
As Sophia Petrillo would always say in The Golden Girls, picture it, Oliver County, 1977, 2 teenagers find out they're pregnant, and instead of giving their child up for adoption, they get married. And my mother was 6 months pregnant when my parents got married in October of 1977. And in January, my sister came along and they kept her. Thank goodness. I'm so glad to have a big sister who's nearly a decade older than me. But they couldn't get married in my mother's church. She grew up Roman Catholic, one of 11 children. so they had to get married in my father's church, a Lutheran church. I don't know at this point what it was, because what I grew up with as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, was formed in the 80s from a combined um, multi-perspective of Lutheranism. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. So we would go to church on Christmas and Easter, and then I had First Communion, and I had to go to confirmation, where I can still remember why this matters. It's like learning history, like when we had to learn like the New Testament, the order of the books. You know, you'd go Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians. Like we had all these hand gestures that Pastor Erickson taught us as if order mattered. All of that was very boring to me. Somehow I ended up going to a Lutheran college. I didn't really tour them exclusively. I thought I would go to Reed College, was the other one competing against St. Olaf, but they felt way too liberal for me. They smoked marijuana that I knew of when I visited. I thought, oh my goodness, what is this, you know? And I started going to chapel at St. Olaf College when this, 6'6" pastor who literally looked like Dumbledore, Pastor Benson, who probably should get a Rainbow Heart for how many of us came out to him. It was such an academic treatment of religion. I mean, Lutheranism is founded by an academic, by Martin Luther. I mean, there are 95 theses that, he took on the Catholic Church. You might have heard of that event. So to me, it always seemed as an intellectual pursuit. It still does in those ways. I still claim to be a Lutheran. I haven't gone to church in a long time during the plague times. But I love the Bible as literature. I find it so interesting, God in the whirlwind with Job, they're all ecological questions. Isn't it a batshit crazy story to be in the belly of a fish for 3 days? I don't view these things as literal happenings. I view them as great stories and great literature. They're also stories that can do great harm to people. And so there's that risk with this too. And the church has done great harm to people. But in 2009, my church, the ELCA, passed that you could ordain openly gay clergy, queer clergy. And this was right before I had no clue what I wanted to do. I was the first in my family to go to college. I'd applied to seminary because it felt like a continuation of a liberal arts education, language, philosophy, theology, practicalness in society. It felt incredible. And I had gotten into Princeton Seminary where I was going to pay $1,000 a year with room and board to live 2 blocks away from where Einstein last lived. And I grew up in a trailer house in Center, North Dakota. I thought I'd gone to the moon, like Toni Morrison was on campus, Joyce Carol Oates, a great art gallery. It felt incredible. And I thought I would go on then to get a PhD in English literature. It to me was such an intellectual pursuit, and that felt wonderful because I love hymns, I love music, I love the language of being there and being close by in moments that people need people to be there. To me, it's not so much this idea of what comes next, it's what's happening now, of being present and being near in people's suffering and in their joy and in their marriages and in their divorces. And that to me felt so important because there's so few opportunities to do that regularly as an adult. I'm just lazy. I mean, I'm gay and tired, I'm just like, I'm looking for some easy community here, I guess. And so there's a way where when I got outed, my father, who I literally have never seen read a book, he said, well, I don't read the Bible, but I know it says God created man, he created woman, and he said, be together, and I thought, that does show you how afraid people can be, because this was a month before I left for Princeton Seminary. My sister would later say, Taylor, it shows you how terrified they were that our father, who has never read the Bible, is going to argue with his son who's going to Princeton Seminary. I mean, it just shows you how religion can be co-opted as a weapon against people even when people have no clue what they're actually saying. And those are times in which we've lived, in which we continue to live, but I have had the great fortune of being in religious spheres where people can be their full resplendent selves and that be affirmed, and people show up and celebrate that as well.
I think that chapter was the most unexpected chapter for me, this grace and the community, to see you really, to see this speaking person, fill in all their colors within this religious community. And I noticed that after that chapter, there starts to be lots more dialogue. So suddenly it's like you literally found your voice. We hear you literally speaking more in the chapters that follow the church chapter than this descriptive voice that kind of comes before. I want to make sure other people have a chance to hear all these amazing things you have to say too. Let me close my part of this by asking about one more theme in this book, which is the theme of the family estrangement. Which is another through line through the whole thing, and it feels connected and sort of tangled up with the religious part of it, because you and the violence part of it, not only because your father invokes the Bible upon hearing you're gay, but your mother's first reaction is to invoke again Matthew Shepard. She doesn't want to see you become Matthew Shepard, right? So the violence and the religiosity of this landscape are now words spoken by your parents, and that becomes the beginning of a rift that keeps growing throughout this book. And again, I think there, just in the way you narrate violence, the way you narrate disownment by a family and being cast out, is not what we think of. It happens almost casually. It happens incrementally, because we see you go back. You have, well, I won't give away all the plot, but you end up back in your parents' house. You end up coming back for an important funeral. And yet the distance between you grows. So in other words, there's not this cinematic moment where someone is throwing your clothes and your suitcase out the window and telling you, leave us, and then you never return again, right? But rather it happens in these small but painful ways that continue throughout the book. And I know that that really resonated with my own estrangements, and especially, I'm 62, people in my generation have stories to tell about the terrible choice between announcing who you are and then knowing that has the power to wreck these relationships, whether in this incremental way you described or in these more dramatic ways. But I think that in incremental ways, these slow, gradual ways are the more irrevocable, are the almost less reversible. And there's a power that and a tragedy that builds throughout when we begin to see, we have these hopes because we see you and your different family members and kind of different constellations of you come together, and this kind of talking that might heal but never does. And I have to tell you that for me, the story that you narrate and the scene of you standing there holding a bouquet of flowers that you had intended to give to your mother, and then her driving away, it what most closely it hits home is an actual story in my own life from my partner Diane, who lived for years just a few miles away from the parents who disowned her for being gay, so that she could drive by their house and see that the Christmas wreath that she had given her mother was hanging on the door, right? And wondering, do they ever think of me? And I know there's that refrain in your book too, wondering how could someone have a child? Are they thinking of me? Am I still part of this family? Am I still connected to these? Yeah, say more about that. That was very powerful.
I think what can be hard for people, and I can now speak with some stability in this now that the book is out and getting messages. I am not a parent, And I think this book can be very hard for parents because parents who've reached out to me almost use me as their own sort of microtherapist to say, well, a parent's first and last thing is to love and protect their child. And my book very much calls that into question, you know, that without saying it, it sort of proves that love is in fact conditional, or at least a version of love that many of us think is unconditional. That I don't think love looks like what I've experienced after I've said, in my words, the shortest, most life-changing sentence, you know, I am gay. I mean, you can say I love you to someone and you're not going to get disowned by your family. You might say, well, I don't love you back, or like, oh goodness, you know, but like people aren't going to, you know, you don't say, for instance, if you say to someone, I love you, they're not going to say, you burn in hell, you know, like, I mean, that's a little flip, but that's the reality when we're talking about the difference in numbers of letters here in this phrase. And so there's a way that my book, I think, can be unsettling for people who question, how could parents do this? Well, of course, parents have been doing it for a long time and continue to do it, and they'll do it after my book and after my story as well. That I don't know that that wound ever heals. I know mine has not. Life has to continue. You know, it's not that I try to keep the possibility open. I don't have any earthly way to understand how that could come back, and I don't wish it. I don't really even think about that. How I think about my own experience is that maybe people who begin your life with you don't get to go through all of your life with you. And that's at least a way I understand what's happened to me. Because to cling to some imagined unproven hope that people will change their mind, they'll admit they're wrong, that's its own version of punishment. And I have a big, complicated life yet to live. But there is no doubt that that type of divorce is painful and hard. And like you say, that slow accretion gives you more opportunity over time to ask sort of insidious questions, for lack of a better way. I mean, it's not to romanticize, again, violence. A huge break, you can at least say, well, they were being assholes, all of that. That's a violence. You can have that reaction. But a slow dissolution, you know, the slow fraying, whatever the right words are, of a relationship is so hard because it takes time for that to happen. It's not a violent moment.
And the intentionality comes through because people have
right.
multiple chances to walk this back or try a different narrative strategy, or
right. Or to say a short sentence, I was wrong, I am sorry, and those things never come. And then you're like, am I cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs over here? Why is that too much to expect from someone? So yeah.
Listen, I want you to have the last word before we hear from other people. So could I invite you to give us a short reading? And I have in mind actually just the opening of the prologue, which is just called C, and it's the creation myth of the book. It is Genesis retold. So like Queer Eye on the ocean here. And I just want, and you choose any part of this you want, it's not that long, but I want people to hear the kind of resonant, like almost sacred part of this, which is, it's almost like a little set piece all of its own. It's so masterful. So let us hear your voice, Taylor.
Well, it means you so much to me for you calling this part out, because my toes curl when I think about this, because when I was writing, I was like, oh my God, if I got this wrong, Sandra is calling me out on it. So
oh, you know I would.
I feel more emboldened that I should read this. And I will Yeah, I will read it, and then I welcome any questions in the chat or anything is on the table from our conversation or beyond tonight. So can close your eyes or sip your martini like I've been doing, and we'll go back to the primordial sea. Before it was an ocean of grasses, the prairie was a shallow sea. Salt water sloshed for millennia as rounded grains of quartz sand were swept from the dry land into the surf. When the quartz finally settled down into the beds thousands of yards thick, trilobites, those bottom-feeding arthropods, crawled onto the large shelf of sand. Generation after generation of trilobites, a number stretching to near infinity, would die, covered by sediment, sludge, and mud. Weight and time would then transfigure the trilobites into a massive underground sea of gas and oil-rich rock. As the sediment settled, a large delta emerged. Swamps, lagoons, meandering rivers, and vast forested floodplains. Trees expanding 12 feet in diameter and more than 100 feet tall grew like a prehistoric version of the Everglades. Plants growing in the swamps, lagoons, and marshes perished. They too were submerged underwater. Oxygen could not exist in the shallow bowls of plant debris, so the plants were broken down slowly but inexorably by anaerobic bacteria. But a thick layer of plant material did not fully decompose, and vast beds of peat accumulated. The surrounding streams changed course, and when they did, sprinkled sand and silt atop the peat. Layer upon layer, some more than 50 feet deep, weighed down the peat beds that, over time, transformed into seams of lignite coal only a few feet thick. Volcanoes shot ash into the atmosphere. The ash floated on the air streams. Ancient waterways flowing north and east carry silt and clay. Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, and other dinosaurs roamed the ancient verdant land. When a meteor struck what is now Mexico, the age of dinosaurs abruptly ceased. A blanket of dust and sand covering these creatures' thewy flesh. Ferns wilted and died. The weight of it all pressed the coal and oil down. Then came the great sheets of ice, miles thick, from the north. Boulders were picked up like tennis balls and dropped along the way. The middle of what would become the North American continent was bulldozed and reshaped into a vast open plain.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Simmons, we're going to bounce this back to you now and ask for your help in moderating this conversation that's about to happen.
Yes, thank you. First, let's everybody give a round of applause
Yeah.
to Sandra and Taylor for that beautiful, beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. So insightful. So we've had one question, which is a good reminder to post any other questions in the chat. And I'm actually going to call on Catherine Young now to ask her question.
Hi, Taylor. I was very, very interested in what you had to say about otherness. I also grew up in coal mining. I also know what it is to escape into books and have the glory of that. But because of what you said, I wonder if otherness is a part of being a writer. The otherness causes observation, is what you said. So does that mean so many of us who are writers have had an otherness in our lives?
Thank you for that question. There are, my close friends will know this, I often describe myself as a trinity of tailors. There's the tailor you see, who is dressed very informally tonight and for the first time. And then I have a disability, I'm a type 1 diabetic, which operates every waking and sleeping moment of my life. So there's that version. Then there's writer Taylor, who's thinking about how would I describe the timbre of your voice or the light that's striking you? How would I describe the color of your hair? I can't turn that Taylor off. Either that Taylor has always been there, or that Taylor has grown into who he is. And so even when I'm at a cocktail party, I'm there. People think I'm there, and I am there, but I'm also recording it into the, for lack of a better word, hard drive of my memory to use later, whether that's in nonfiction or fiction or in a poem. And so there's a way where being a writer is simultaneously exhausting and yet thrilling, because you're never off. You're having a good time while you're trying to think about, how would I describe the good time? And how would I describe it in language that sends electricity through another person's brain and body, you know? And so I mean, by default, the easy answer is I agree with you. We are othered because, in fact, even though I might be rare in the jungle kingdom of writers, I'm an extreme extrovert. I like to be where the action is. We're always trying to get the gossip to use for later. And that you have to be slightly outside to bear that. Otherwise, you're just involved, you know? So thank you for that question.
Do we have any other questions? We've had a few comments from Janine Bear and Lisa Moody. I haven't seen any other questions, though. Maybe we open it up a little bit. Does anybody have a question? Speak it out loud.
Go for it,
Allison, then you
Allison.
guys.
Hi, Taylor. You know, I love the book and I love you, and that was beautiful to hear that. Thank you, Sandra, for facilitating this evening. But one thing that didn't, I mean, we've talked a lot about this book. I think it's a beautiful book in so many ways. And one thing that didn't get talked about tonight, I'd love to hear you speak about it a bit. I think it would mean something to people too, is, you know, we see the suffering in family life really beautifully rendered, terribly rendered in the book. But there's also something very beautiful in your friendship and love for your little nephews. And I've heard you speak a lot about not only them, but other young boys growing up in places like North Dakota. And I think one of the most beautiful things I've heard you say, I'll say it won't sound as great when I say it because it's not you, but I'll say it anyway for you and you can elaborate. But you wrote this book to save the lives of some of those boys. Yeah. And I think this book could certainly do that. And I'd love to hear you talk about that aspect of the book because I think it's important.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. Thank you for being here and just for the deep friendship we both have. It means a lot to me too. It's a great ballast in my bow. And, you know, I've been asked certain things around this, particularly in radio interviews. Why did you write this book? You know, the easy sort of low hanging fruit. And then you don't want to be an asshole, but sometimes I like being an asshole and say like, it doesn't exist. You know, it's like, name the number of writers from North Dakota that you know, it maybe can fill one hand. But part of it is we're talking about a vast region, the Northern Great Plains. We're talking about the Intermountain West. And we're talking about, you know, when you can't pull a book off a library shelf that reflects who you are, we talk a lot right now about being seen. I usually read to be disturbed and taken outside myself to go, oh my God, that's possible. But there is something deep in us that needs to be nourished and to know if I'm encountering a huge body of stories and I'm never seeing anyone quite like me, that can drive you insane. It can make you feel very lonely. I speak with some experience there as someone who was reaching for books on a bookshelf that didn't exist growing up. And so there's a part of this, the book I've written, I view as an act of obligation to that young boy I was, and that young boy that's still in me. It's almost articulating my own life of saying, how could parents do this? How could I grow up with magical grandparents? How could my nephews find it the least interesting thing about me that they have a gay uncle, you know, and that they would rather know, you know, what do you like better, you know, tortellini or spaghetti? That's more interesting than being gay, which just shows me how it can be taken for granted in the best sense of that. You know, that maybe when people grow up in certain conditions, things do shift. I think about, he's on this call and I won't necessarily name him, but a dear friend of mine, a story that means a lot to me from North Dakota, in a smaller town that I grew up with. This is a story just talking about why write a book, how do stories keep you going, how do they not only convince you to stay alive, but sustain you in your aliveness. Here's a story that I cling to still. There's a wonderful singer out there who grew up in central North Dakota in a tiny town of something like fewer than 20, and leaves to study voice, goes to Juilliard, eventually becomes a noted Broadway performer. And his father, who is old enough, I will say, to probably be more my grandfather, the son comes out to the father and his wife. And insofar as I've heard this story, the father and mother stay quiet. The son goes into his room. And the dad comes in about a half hour later, let's say, or minutes later, and says, you know, we need to apologize to you. This is in North Dakota. This is when probably before I was born. And the son said, why do you need to apologize to me? And the father says, because we didn't raise you in a house where you felt safe enough to tell us this sooner. And I thought that was so powerful for me, because this is a dear friend who I view as the epitome of openness, generosity, compassion, who also had his own sense of self to apologize to his son. You know, and that to me is just not the world I grew up in, for instance, you know. And so part of that is, I think, in writing a book, is to create a longer narrative than what we see on Twitter or Instagram. Is to give people a story to live into, to say it might not be easy. I don't know how it will turn out, but here is a longer story you can sit with, rather than a TikTok or a tweet and things like that. And that is what I've tried to do. I just think I needed a book like this growing up. So then I felt called to write it. And I'm glad you asked that, Allison. Thank you for asking that. And thank you for being here tonight.
Beautiful. Thank you, Taylor and Allison. Any other questions for our conversants this evening? I'm not seeing anything. Sandra, any last words you'd like to share?
Just my absolute congratulations, Taylor. We have been friends as you have written all these different chapters, and you know, you did this through the isolation of the pandemic, and I saw you kind of on fire with the story, and the ability to weave these things together, and find a voice that is both, I mean, there's some sections in here that are like almost like little staged plays where it's all just dialogue and it's all in the storytelling. And then there are others that are beautifully rendered descriptions with full of imagery, and then there are other kind of very, not so much, I wouldn't call it argumentative essay, but I would say very declarative, where you just kind of come out and say, I'm going to tell you what wrestling means, and then you do it, right? And so to have that sort of facility of voice, doing it all alone in the isolation I know you were working in, is amazing to me, because you've created a whole world in this book, and now its moment has arrived. So here we are in this terrible time when U-Hauls full of Proud Boys are at pride parades. The amount of violence against the LGBTQ community is up fourfold. since the Trump administration, and it hasn't gone down. It just keeps accelerating. And then, of course, the catastrophic Roe v. Wade decision of this week. It's so all of a sudden out comes this book that you've created that it is a book of the moment that we all really need. And so knowing how miserable and lonely writing can be, and then knowing how the right book is the opposite of miserable and lonely when it finds its place in the world, and you're like standing right at the cusp with the misery behind you, and now here's the communion of the book entering the world of the readers. So I just want to stand in awe of you for a minute and just say, I love you, brother. You did it. And this is an amazing thing. And it's amazing to me to read it as an object in my hand, as it was the many drafts I read, the many Zoom calls you and I had where you read it out loud and we both cried, and then you revised it. I see myself in this. I'm 30 years older than you, and we don't have that much of our life history in common, but that's what literature does, is it's a mirror and also a kind of platform on which we can stand and see the rest of the world. So bravo.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank you all for making time to be here tonight. There's so many people I love and admire on this call, and it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Sandra. And thank you for all of that and for your questions. And I look forward to seeing you all around and hopefully in person, and happy Pride Month as we wrap it up. And the work continues, and I'm going to keep doing mine with you all, and I know you will as well. And thank you all for being present tonight.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Sandra. It's such a beautiful evening. I'm so honored and delighted that you could share it with us and with the Terrain.org family. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.